Wrap me in your arms. I can't feel it, but
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
in your arms.
We'll give people another minute or so
Feel it, but
to roll in from their last meeting before we get started.
get up, get down, get up, get down. Feel the total rotation start. See the next one wake. Get up, get down, get up, get down, get up. Sentiments the same, but the pair of feet change. I know my words will dry upon the skin, just like.
All right. Thanks for being here, everybody. I'm Sarah Bartel from ChangeLab Solutions, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. This is the first of a two-part webinar series on policy tools for rural equity and prosperity. In partnership with the Geographic Health Equity Alliance, GEA, we're pulling together multiple threads from different portfolios at ChangeLab Solutions, upstream policy approaches to address structural discrimination and improve rural prosperity, with a deep dive into the policy process and some examples next week. We're starting today with part one, history, impact, and possibility, establishing a shared terminology and the legal history of structural discrimination and structural racism in this country. We'll talk about present-day rural impacts as well as upstream policy solutions to advance rural health equity and the possible partnerships and provisions and discussions that might flow from them in your work. We'll open with a word from our partners at GEA. Abby?
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Abby Nellis, and I am an associate with CADCA's Geographic Health Equity Alliance, or GEA for short. GEA, in partnership with ChangeLab Solutions, is excited to present part one of the Policy Tools for Rural Equity and Prosperity webinar series, History, Impact, and Possibility. GEA is a CDC-funded national network dedicated to reducing geographic health disparities related to commercial tobacco and cancer, and is jointly funded by CDC's Division of Cancer Prevention and Control and Office on Smoking and Health. Using a community-led approach, GEA specializes in helping state tobacco and cancer programs and their partners, such as state coalitions, local public health departments, and local coalitions, build capacity to implement effective public health practices, such as policy, systems, and environmental change strategies that positively impact community health. GEA is committed to improving the health of communities across our nation, and the purpose of this webinar series is to provide state and local coalitions with tangible examples of how upstream policy solutions can be used as tools for addressing barriers to health and prosperity. We encourage you to visit our website, geohealthequity.org, to learn more and subscribe to our monthly newsletter. Next slide. I'm sure we are all familiar with Zoom by now, but I'd like to go over a few housekeeping notes. All participants are muted by default. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation, so for any specific questions for the presenters, please use the Q&A box. You will receive a post-webinar email with the recording of the webinar, slides, and an evaluation survey. We kindly ask you to fill out the survey. Please note, letters of attendance are given only upon completion of the evaluation survey. I will now pass it back to you, Sarah.
Thanks. Our learning objectives today are to, they'll look familiar already. 1, define the history of structural discrimination. 2, recognize past and present inequities flowing from that history differently in different rural communities. And finally, to highlight those community-driven upstream policy approaches that show promise to address those barriers and improve health and well-being for everyone. First, a little bit more about us and all of you, the other people in the room today. Jessica?
Thanks, Sarah. So Change Lab Solutions is a national nonprofit, and we believe in advancing equitable laws and policies to ensure healthy lives for all. We believe that everyone should get a fair shot at living their best lives, regardless of where they live, what they look like, how much money they make, or where they get their news. We're an interdisciplinary team of lawyers, planners, policy analysts, and other professionals, and we partner with state and local governments, organizations, and anchor institutions to invest in thriving communities. I'm joined today by Sarah, who you already heard from, and our colleague Shannon Rempey. We are each connected to the strains of the research we're discussing today in different ways. We've hyperlinked our names here if you'd like to read more about us. And you can also email us when you get the slides if you'd like to connect, or to any of the Change Lab Solutions staff whose work we'll be sharing today. The projects we're discussing belong to many of our colleagues here at Change Lab, as well as the partners that we'll name as we go along. Our thanks to everyone for the honor of sharing this work. In addition to this slide, there are hyperlinked resources throughout the presentation that include specific acknowledgements for each resource. Feel free to take a look at those for your reference. So at Change Lab, when we talk about health equity, we say that health equity is when everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible, which requires removing obstacles to health, such as poverty, discrimination, and their consequences. That definition is from Dr. Paula Braverman, who's an expert on health equity and social justice, and it emphasizes the need to address the root causes that lead to inequities in our communities. In one of our core publications that's called the Blueprint for Change Makers, we name 5 different fundamental drivers of health inequity that are embedded in our systems and institutions. Those drivers are structural discrimination, which includes structural racism, income inequality and poverty, governance that limits meaningful participation, disparities in opportunities like jobs and education, and disparities in political power. Our challenge is to change the distribution of healthy environments, economic resources, and opportunities by shifting how law and policy are used to promote health. Sarah, can you talk a little bit more about what this has to do with our audience today?
Thanks, Jessica. Our emphasis on these upstream drivers of health have flowed through 5 approaches that we're sharing today. Starting in the middle, the tools of law and policy as levers controlling how resources like environmental, economic, and other health promoting investments are distributed. Out from there, the fundamental drivers of health inequity, today as applied to the legal history of structural racism research that Shannon will be sharing, and the geographic or place-based angle through our rural community research and practice partnerships, as well as the consumer product portfolio through tobacco, food, and related systems. Given all these overlapping partners and work, I have approximately 23 slides of disclaimers I have to get through. So grab your coffee and bear with me. Obviously, some of this work was funded by CDC, multiple offices and divisions and centers, both the Public Health Law Program and Office for Smoking and Health, or OSH. We are not lobbying today and do not represent the views of CDC or our other funder partners that we'll talk about as we go. In general, Change Lab doesn't provide legal advice or enter attorney-client relationships. We're providing research and information. As many of you are also funded by CDC, you may want to check out this guidance explaining lobbying limitations and what other activities are allowed. Finally, we recognize many ceremonial and traditional uses of tobacco, and we intend to discuss commercial tobacco today. Shannon?
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, hi everyone. Let's just take a beat to learn more about who all is here. We're going to share a poll. If you can put what state you're in, We know that your state does not define you, but it can help provide a glimpse into the range of experiences among participants today. The poll is also going to ask to share your organizational or institutional setting with all those options listed. And then a bit of an icebreaker, considering how hot it is already, at least where I'm living. You can select your summer beverage of choice.
And I have two caveats to that, Shannon, so I'm going to jump in real fast. First of all, I wrote state on the slide. That is my mistake. It could be state, tribal, territorial, local, wherever, whatever locality makes sense for you to describe. And also, I think there might be a few questions from farther down in the webinar. If the poll, feel free to answer any of the poll questions that make sense or hold off on any that don't yet feel right. Are the results popping up for that we can share? I'm not seeing any.
Yes, the results are popping up.
Oh, great. Okay. So I am not seeing
Okay.
them, but if anybody
Yeah,
wants
I
to
haven't
reflect
seen
on
them
what we're
either.
seeing, that's fine. Otherwise, I think we should go ahead and get moving.
Okay, oh, I
Oh.
see them now.
There it is.
Okay, great. I guess we'll have to go in and look at the
Oh, interesting.
individual.
So yeah, lots of local and community-based organizations and coalitions. We're excited to see you. Welcome. State and local government, some federal government, some tribal government. This is interesting. 6% health sector partners. Very, very cool to see people from different sectors in this space. Lots of iced tea and cappuccino. I feel like coffee has been a theme of this morning already. Some protein shakes, some iced tea, some lemonade.
Okay, great. Thank you for participating in our poll. Before we dive into the content today, I just want to acknowledge today's content isn't easy. Though the research is nonpartisan, the current climate makes conversations like this even harder than usual. So please participate as you feel comfortable and step away if you need to. We will continue to use words like equity and racism and structural discrimination, while acknowledging that you all come to these words with varying levels of comfort or limitation. Even the term rural obviously has a range of meanings. These terms reflect differences. The values underlying our work differ, and terminology is just part of that. There's also a tension today between facing hard parts of history and the desire to focus on community assets. We try to strike that balance. You may like and adopt our pivot points, or you may need to reflect on what doesn't feel quite right about our balance. Both reflections are helpful and necessary parts of this conversation. Lastly, today's topics may have professional and personal repercussions, reflecting realities and truths differently for different folks. So be self-aware of your own experience and take care of yourself, and be aware of how you might impact others. To help navigate this territory, Jessica is going to share some meeting agreements that we use in our work internally and in groups like this.
Thanks, Shannon. So we have some meeting agreements that we like to set out before we start anything. So we want to all agree to create a safe space for each other and avoid interrupting. We will try to avoid distractions and be thoughtful about our language, make sure we are speaking from personal experience and avoiding generalizations. And we will also be aware of our intersecting and overlapping power dynamics. We will participate without resisting facilitation. Please feel free to use that Q&A function and help us create interesting polls like the ones we just had. And we're going to assume best intentions, but realize that there may be slippages between our intent and our impact on others. Finally, our goal today is not to always agree, but to gain deeper understanding. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Shannon for the legal history of structural discrimination and specifically structural racism.
Thanks, Jessica. So we'll begin with a bird's eye view. This timeline outlines the extraction of value and control in rural places in the United States, starting with colonization of land and people, then the commodification of resources, next industrialization, then privatization and related protections for those private interests. Most recently, the technologization of work, education, healthcare, and many other elements of daily living. This extraction was memorialized in laws and policies, from the tax code to community planning practices. It resulted in the consolidation of wealth and other resources, resulting in gaps that are still spreading today. This same timeline is also a story of the tobacco and food industries in the US, which influence our communities irrespective of our unique goals and rich cultures. Colonized, commodified, industrialized, privatized, and co-opted, as is the case with technology, to thwart our health. Structural discrimination, based on race, ethnicity, and class, also serves as an overlapping story on this same timeline, resulting in cumulative impacts in rural places. And while they are different histories, there is an underlying structure of control, extraction, and devaluation or discrimination, which all have important similarities across these experiences. Specifically, realizing that alignment in one of the strongest ways we can change this narrative. Let's look to some data to back this up. So there are many rural areas with disproportionately large shares of Black, Hispanic, Latino, Native American, or Alaskan Native communities within their populations. This map was developed with our partners at the Center on Rural Innovation, and you can read more about the definitions and the data at the links provided here. For example, we know the term rural can be defined in different ways with various implications for how it's used in each instance. The main point here is that the threads pulling together the experiences of disinvestment and discrimination based on income, class, and race and ethnicity are not just one-off stories. These next maps show this narrative as well. So you can look back at this slide later, but I'll summarize that measures of persistent poverty among Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC, in rural counties reveals that distributions of rural income inequities are often correlated with race, even when those relationships are not as visible due to segregation or for groups whose histories are less well known. More visible correlations are, for example, Black people in the rural South, Indigenous people on tribal lands, Latino American and Hispanic people in the South and West, and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Hawaii and Alaska. These maps try to make place, race, and class intersections more visible. A more eloquent description of this dynamic is from our publication, Advancing Racial Equity in Rural Communities, which states it is important to consider the fundamental intersectionality of place, race, and class as dimensions of discrimination when thinking about the developing solutions to address equity in rural communities. Although using an intersectional lens in rural communities is complicated and challenging, it is essential. The compounding effects are most acutely felt by BIPOC experiencing persistent poverty in rural communities. As our colleague Shaniqua says, the intersectional lens plus the community voice is where the magic is, which is our goal in this series. So the legal history of structural racism research I'm going to share is part of a long-term project with CDC's public health law program, in which we partnered with expert advisory committee of scholars and practitioners, including those with both lived experience and leaders in shaping the alignment between racial equity, public health, and law and policy. The legal research and structure have been iterated in many conversations over time, and we're hoping to include modules like today's material in the Public Health Law Academy, which is available at changelabsolutions.org. So as a precursor to some themes that will come up today, let's start with a few definitions. Racism is an organized social system in which the dominant racial group, based on an ideology of inferiority, categorizes and ranks people into social groups called races. And the dominant group uses its power to devalue, disempower, and differentially allocate valued societal resources and opportunities to groups defined as inferior. And race is primarily a social category based on nationality, ethnicity, phenotypic, or other markers of social difference, which captures differential access to power and resources in society. So consider the findings of the Human Genome Project, which estimate that humans as a species share 99.9% of our DNA with each other. So there's more genetic variation. In the Human Genome Project found that more genetic variation was found within a race than between races. So from an anthropologist's view, race is not a biological concept, yet it is undeniably a social and political one. And racism functions on multiple levels. The most common understanding of racism in the US is probably the interpersonal level, such as personal prejudice and intentional biases. This system map provides more detail. Internalized racism here in the corner is a symptom of a much larger, much more ingrained system of racism that includes cultural norms and institutional policies and practices that routinely produce racial and equitable outcomes regardless of intent. Cultural racism, up here on the left, refers to the idea of inferiority as part of the values, language, imagery, and assumptions of the larger society. So here, think about how media normalizes certain stereotypes. And then institutional racism includes processes embedded in laws, policies, and practices that privilege some and oppress others. This system is what we refer to as structural racism today. All types of racism reinforce each other and influence multiple systems such as housing, labor, credit, and economic markets, as well as the education, criminal, legal, and healthcare systems. And lastly, to create a framing for this, I want to introduce the concept of the hierarchy of human value. So the belief that some people are more worthy of experiencing well-being and the benefits of democracy. Those people's rights and values get prioritized and others get devalued. When the priorities become part of laws and culture, that seemingly reinforces the underlying beliefs, which perpetuates constructed human systems such as political, economic, and moral systems that hold those other groups as inferior while privileging the priority groups. So this is all intersectional, meaning it involves various social factors in addition to race, such as class, disability status, gender identity, sexuality, religion, age, education level, immigration status, and language. So now let's get into some of the legal history. First, the historical themes and beliefs that led to the exploration and colonization of our country requires that we introduce the doctrine of discovery. This was an international law principle, which was developed primarily by Spain, Portugal, England, and the Catholic Church in the 15th and early 16th centuries, and determined that discovering countries automatically gained sovereign and property rights over the land, regardless of who was already living there. The United States was created with this settler colonial framework by individuals who arrived with the entitlement of their legal rights to establish permanent and exclusive control over their discovery. And of course, racialized narratives of superiority were part of this process by first removing, destroying, and replacing indigenous populations, making the invaded lands profitable by importing slaves, an example of anti-Black racism, and then using the exploitable labor of immigrants. So that first part of the framework, indigenous elimination, can be categorized broadly into the following buckets. 1, extermination. 2, confinement to reservations with cultural assimilation. And 3, termination or physical erasure. And the legal history starts immediately with labeling American Indians as, quote, savages, underlying both the Declaration of Independence and the ratification of the Constitution. The resulting government-backed genocide moved west in the 19th century and into the 19th century, which included the first major related legislation, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which led to the infamous Trail of Tears. The reservation system supported physical and cultural erasure with biological and cultural assimilation programs, beginning formally in 1819 with the Civilization Fund Act. These practices went so far as child abduction, religious conversion, and forced resocialization in residential boarding schools, an era that lasted from 1860 to 1978, traumatizing many generations of students. In the 1950s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs official policy was to relocate Native Americans to cities, and in an effort to eliminate the need for reservations. The Indian Relocation Act was specifically passed in 1956. At the same time, House Concurrent Resolution 108 was passed in Congress to try and terminate tribes entirely, citing the oil, uranium, valuable timber, and other natural resources found on Indian land. Different versions of this indigenous elimination story also play out in the US territories, including the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893 and the colonization of Puerto Rico following the Spanish-American War in 1898. And there are unfortunately many examples of anti-Black racism, both explicitly and implicitly written into the laws of the United States. Slavery being an obvious example of anti-Black racism, but lesser known are the court cases and laws that both codified slavery and created race. So first, we have a 1640 court case in the colony of Virginia. An African indentured servant by the name of John Punch escapes from his servitude with 2 other indentured servants, a Dutchman and a Scotsman. When they are caught, the Dutchman and Scotsman are given 4 additional years of servitude as punishment, but the African is given what we see codified for the first time as perpetual servitude or slavery. And this is also the first time that Africans and Europeans were treated differently in the law. Then came some of the first acts that would later make up Virginia's slave code. So first, ensuring the children of enslaved women who were raped by their owners wouldn't try to claim freedom through their fathers. And then by 1682, the Virginia House of Burgesses, the first legislative body in colonial America, passed a law limiting citizenship and thus rights to Virginia land to Europeans, defining all non-Europeans as, quote, Negroes, Moors, mulattoes, and Indians, which were, quote, slaves to all intents and purposes. And third, 9 years later, in 1691, another law outlawing interracial marriage, describing full citizens as, quote, white, the first documented use of the word white as opposed to English, European, or Christian. Of course, the Constitution is full of compromises made between the North and South over the issue of slavery, including the Three-Fifths Compromise of 1787, counting 3 out of every 5 enslaved people, that is, each enslaved person was 3/5 of a person, to determine a state's population for the purpose of taxation and representation in Congress. Then Congress's Naturalization Act of 1790, which codified racial exclusion nationally by restricting citizenship and all its accompanying rights to any free white person. This legal history secured political and economic rights for colonists on a global scale. Through the Revolutionary War, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and Congress's 1808 Act prohibiting the importation of slaves. And the US slavery then shifted to the domestic trade market, where anti-Black racism persisted in many other ways. And then we have immigrant exploitation. So US immigration policy has always had a duality at play based on the legal creation of whiteness. By having open immigration for whites from Northern Europe and racial subordination and exclusion of enslaved people from Africa, Native Americans, and subsequently immigrants from Latin America and Asia. Immigration policy would also come at odds with the 13th Amendment's ban on slavery and the reliance of American economic prosperity on exploitable labor. So in the 19th and 20th centuries, the US recruited workers from China, Japan, and Mexico to work for very low wages in construction, laundry, and agricultural industries. This targeted recruitment was soon followed by legally and culturally degrading these workers through race-based exclusionary immigration laws aimed at the Chinese, race-based internment policies aimed at the Japanese, and through racist mass deportation programs aimed at Mexicans. So this was an extremely shortened historical overview of some US laws carrying out the settled colonialism framework we introduced earlier. This content is dark and disturbing, but it is ultimately provides a story full of racialized narratives of superiority used to justify legal texts and actions. These narratives and the systems that flow from it have certainly changed over time, but the reinforcement of this framework reveals the root causes of why structural racism is simply part of the US legal system, specifically part of deciding who counts or whose rights are worth protecting. Which leads us to the next section of legal history, the push and pull of the Constitution's 14th Amendment Equal Protection Doctrine. But first, I'm going to pass it to Sarah to take a small break.
Oh, Shannon, thank you. Let's take a beat. We're going to zoom out just for a minute. Maybe you want to stand up, shake it out, check in with yourself or the people around you if you are not alone right now. Maybe sense what's happening in your body and how you're feeling, where you might be holding tension. Perhaps also make a note of any follow-up that you feel you might need to set to the side to sustain your focus. Do whatever you need. I'll also remind everybody that the Q&A function is available so that during the Q&A, we can be sure that the panelists have a chance to consider the issues that are coming through the chat. That's the best way for us to track things as the chat continues. For those of you who have already reached out with really thoughtful questions and observations, thank you. So I'm going to count us down before we get back into the content. And I'll remind you that the slides and this recording will be available for you to dive deeper on anything if you do have to step back. So we'll get started again. Take some deep breaths in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So next, Shannon is going to describe some elements of 14th Amendment jurisprudence. So you can read this in full later, but the gist is that this bolded sentence here, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That's what we call the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Basically, the federal government saying that we should all get the same treatment under the protections and requirements that apply to us, whatever jurisdiction we live in. This constitutional clause seems to support the government to address this US history of colonization that Shannon walked us through. But the thing about the Constitution and all laws is that they get interpreted in different ways, and courts make the call about who interpreted it correctly. And those interpretations change over time. And all of that legal history shapes what the law requires people and actors and states to do. For example, to take action or to stay out of things. The legal ups and downs of the 14th Amendment since 1868 are an example of the historical push and pull of social justice and structural discrimination, and the legal or doctrinal forces that have kept it in place. With that, Shannon, I will hand it back to you.
Thanks, Sarah. So here is an overarching timeline of these debates throughout the US legal mechanisms by which these things are decided, implemented and changed or even overturned. Some of this, though very legal and technical, will be familiar, which is a testament to how these legal trajectories, dry as they may be, are powerful indicators and drivers of social change and lived experiences throughout history, including today, exemplifying the persistent impact of structural racial discrimination. So starting with the state action doctrine, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 prohibited racial discrimination in public accommodations, such as hotels, restaurants, and theaters. A set of 1883 cases struck parts of that law as beyond Congress's 14th Amendment enforcement reach. This is the court saying claims of equal protection could justify the federal government restricting state action only, not that of private individuals. Then the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which also prohibited racial discrimination in public accommodations, was upheld when applied to private actors through Congress's commerce power. That is because those private actors or businesses were influencing commercial interactions between states. And cases still pop up, revealing the blurry line between state and private action. Imagine government actors tasked with enforcing private discriminatory contracts, or governments having to make licensing, financing, labor rights, or taxation decisions for businesses that want to discriminate. The question is not clear and very alive, which begs the question of what is a right if it's not certain to be protected depending on who's violating it. Next up, we have on our 14th Amendment journey, the distinction between political and social equality. So until the 1950s, based on the famous Plessy versus Ferguson case, the court said separate but equal train cars in Louisiana and other services in states across the US are perfectly legal because equal protection secures political, not social equality. And after a decades-long legal campaign led by the NAACP and leading advocates such as future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, finally in 1954, with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, the court held that racial segregation in public schools inherently violates equal protection. That is, separate is not equal, and the case starts to unravel reliance on this blurry distinction between political and social equality as a right that is in the eyes of the law. And then in 1971, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was interpreted such that someone could show disparate impact, or that an action affected them or people of that race differently. It could establish a case of discrimination. In 1976, however, a case brought under the Equal Protection Clause decided for that claim you needed more than disparate impact to get the court to really closely review the action. You had to show discriminatory purpose or intent, which is much harder to prove than impact. Otherwise, the court would review the state's action with more deference, so that impact now carried little to no weight in establishing an equal protection violation. Lastly, the ups and downs of classifications under the law when race is at play. Until 1967, if a law or other state action classified people based on race, there was no difference in the eyes of the court than if the classification was based on income or zip code, for example. No extra close looking into what's going on. But with the famous Loving case, the court said, no, the right to marry who you want is too important. The government cannot limit marriage rights based on race. So racial classifications require extra scrutiny by courts. They set a higher bar, this compelling interest jargon, for government actors to use race as a way to allocate rights and responsibilities. School admissions cases, as you're probably aware, are another example. For a long time, diversity in educational settings was considered compelling, and schools could take race into account for admissions. But in 2023, that was overturned with some exceptions for settings where diversity remains a compelling government interest. So the marriage example is a good one for us to use as we zoom out to present day real life implications of this legal history. Big ones fall into 3 buckets, each with a robust body of expertise and scholarship behind it that we unfortunately don't have time to go into today. But first, we have civic engagement implications. So for citizenship, as you see on the slide, to the establishment of voting rights and the implications of ongoing voting requirements and gerrymandering. The civil right to marriage, to fair employment, other federal protections and benefits, all that history is reflected in civil engagement and even community engagement. Differences among communities and voting eligible folks who have been subjected to the structural discrimination. The second big bucket is spatial or place-based implications. This is one of the early and most glaring overlaps between structural discrimination and our work in public health law and policy, which is always trying to move the systemic and environmental law of community health interventions. This is also where we see elements that most overlap and accumulate with other inequitable outcomes in rural places. Finally, economic implications of the legal history of structural racism, the global and national economic contexts, the timeline we opened with. This definition of racial capitalism is particularly poignant. And when we layer on the extraction of rural resources in the next section, the impacts and health impacts especially are clearly connected. And one last concept to fold into the legal history I've just shared is preemption. So this is when a higher level of government, like the federal or state, limits or invalidates what a lower level of government, like state or locality, can do with their laws and policies. This can lead to protections for people and communities that have been marginalized. For example, a state setting a protective minimum wage for all employees. However, preemption is often used to limit local governments from responding to marginalization and protecting their own people and communities. This could be when a state limits the ability of local government to enact eviction protections, for example. At ChangeLab, we evaluate preemption based on how it serves or hinders health and health equity. Preemption is only as valuable or harmful as its impacts on the people it's intended to work for. So now I'm going to turn it back to Sarah to help pull this all together.
Thanks, Shannon. Ultimately, for those of you who may be working on policies that directly address or take into account structural racism as a root cause, stay tuned, join the ChangeLab Solutions mailing list. We are actively monitoring and conversing with scholars and practitioners about what these legal developments mean for how we can ensure the 14th Amendment and other legal doctrines secure the rights that flow from all people being created equal, right? I'll also flag at this slide that we're well aware that many of you, as with many of our partners around the country, have to be careful about the language that you use to talk about your work and how it touches root causes like this. So I've also included here what this means for rural policymaking, regardless of whether or not you are directly addressing structural discrimination and structural racism. So for rural policymaking more generally, here are the 4 takeaways we've pulled together. The first is that existing laws and policies inherited this history, and some still perpetuate inequities. Number 2, especially right now, we know that there are laws being used to limit conversations about race, place, and class. Number 3, rural policy approaches can be used to address persistent inequities stemming from discrimination and racism, whether or not they engage with the terms we've just defined. Finally, policy approaches to address structural discrimination are not only complementary to policies that promote rural prosperity, they are essential components, part of that prism of rural diversity and the need to center those closest to the issues by sharing, visioning, and decision-making with them. We will talk more about specific policy approaches and solutions in the next sections. Now we will continue this thread that Shannon started us on, talking about present-day impacts in rural communities. Jessica?
Almost forgot to take myself off mute. So for the next part, we're going to really emphasize the 3 buckets from Shannon's presentation. These things are intensified in rural places and also reflect a shared history right alongside race. So that place and class are pieces of the puzzle, for example, having to do with the subordination, exploitation, and disinvestment of rural resources in communities more broadly. At ChangeLab, we're very proud to work under Thrive Rural, which is an initiative of the Robert Wood Johnson's Foundation. That initiative aims to organize learning, strengthen understanding, as well as catalyze and align action around what it will take for communities and Native nations across the rural U.S. to be the healthiest places they can be, where everyone belongs, lives with dignity, and thrives. Toward Better Rural Futures includes partners ChangeLab Solutions, the National Governors Association, Praxis Project, and the Center on Rural Innovation. This project involved extensive scoping and partnership research, followed by an in-depth policy scan and ongoing engagement with key advisors. And it has resulted in a suite of tools we'll be exploring in these webinars. The interviews that were conducted included local organizers in rural BIPOC communities, staff supporting state level elected officials, staff at state agencies, nonprofit leaders, and subject matter experts. And they were all across 17 states with the highest percentage of rural areas. Here, I'm going to talk about some high-level observations and learnings from that initiative. So one was the need for transformative change, so that the system developed over time to, we know that this system developed over time to exclude necessary partners because of historic structural discrimination and marginalization. That system is still functioning as designed, even if our culture has changed. Yet we also have some unique windows of opportunity. The pandemic resulted in new federal funding opportunities and partnerships, as did some of the recent extreme weather events. This is called attention to the need for investment. Local innovation and tailored terminology are essential. There's a tension between addressing these issues directly and the fear of divisiveness. Lastly, local innovation, such as local innovation is needed, and we also want to consider that preemption will be an important consideration and a baseline challenge to address in some places. Another thing that came out of that project, our guide, Advancing Racial Equity in Rural Communities. The guide describes some impacts and health outcomes, including the correlating persistent barriers to accessing everything people need in order to live their healthiest lives. When we look at present-day health impacts, however, much of these rural and racial threads are interwoven. BIPOC communities experience them at more significant rates and have unique experiences of these structural factors. Things like lower job security, lower access to educational and economic opportunities, less access to safe housing, healthcare, and law enforcement services, but also fewer basics like safe wastewater systems, electricity, healthy food, and running potable water. Less safe communities are also a factor that have fewer sources of connection and other healthy ways of managing all these external stresses. Again, we encourage you to look to the guide for the detail about how these outcomes play out differently among these 4 groups as examples. The fact of having a term like BIPOC at all is a terrible carryover of the breadth of the legal history we just discussed, yet we cannot dissolve these experiences into it. In our guide on advancing rural prosperity, we describe some persistent challenges related to these impacts. Some of those challenges include shortages of essential services, housing limitations, isolation, food and water insecurity or quality issues, climate change impacts, disinvestment, deepening gaps among BIPOC residents, and broadband access. Each of these issues has its own history along that timeline we shared at the beginning, starting with colonization, and they have relevant health burdens and persistent health inequities. And so right now we're going to zoom in on tobacco use and exposure as a case study in downstream health outcomes and related policy responses. We all know of the persistent health inequities when it comes to the burdens and challenges of tobacco use. We see this across place, race, and class in terms of housing impacts, healthy food options, reduced access to meaningful jobs with living wages, and reduced access and uptake of healthcare. And of course, the tobacco industries is one of the most notorious examples of how comparable actors can use chronic disinvestment and discrimination as business opportunities at the sacrifice of local health and well-being and at the cost of local control over what our stores and our local businesses look like, as well as who sponsors our teams and community events. This also might look like what activities are available in our communities to turn to when we're stressed or looking for connection. And all of these lead to the need for policy approaches that move us upstream, focused on environments, and tailored to the local dynamics. Which brings us to other opportunities for rural policy solutions. The assets that are evidence of how rural, including rural BIPOC communities, have thrived. These are opportunities like community connectedness, trade currencies, arts and culture, recreational opportunities, population growth, growth in certain industry and business partnerships, as well as growth in remote work.
Thanks, Jessica. And obviously, these are examples. The unique mix of challenges and opportunities varies by community, rural or not, right? The point here is that to identify and prioritize the challenges that any rural community wants to address, set alongside that community's unique strengths and assets, that's not a conversation that national research can predict. These efforts must stem from local data, local stories, and local partnerships. Economic development efforts, as we say in our guide, need to be tailored to the local context and rooted in an understanding of a community's assets and residents' knowledge of how best to create greater opportunity. Rural centers and rural retail are different. Rural agriculture and industry look different. And rural recreation is diverse. And that diversity, those local stories, those are the essential elements of equity-oriented local policy efforts. Policies can not only build on strengths and address those structural barriers to health in what they aim to achieve, the policy process itself can embed rural community power that's often taken for granted in the US. Some rural policy solutions and policy processes lend themselves particularly well to addressing these root causes. At ChangeLab Solutions, policy menus are our love language, so buckle up in the resources we've already highlighted. For example, our strategy brief on rural prosperity. We emphasize two promising approaches to identifying the rural solutions to best support equitable economic development. People-centered approaches like entrepreneurship, small business supports, and workforce development and training, just to name a few, and place-centered approaches such as housing solutions and tourism and recreation partnerships. Here are policies identified in our Rural Policy Making for Racial Equity Guide, such as agricultural workers' rights, native tourism alliances, housing trust funds, local hiring, support for small water systems, broadband expansion, and paid family leave and paid sick leave. And I've started highlighting so that you can see there are these repercussions among the different resources, which are all stemming from different research and conversations. This is a big one. Remember, you're getting these slides later, but in ChangeLab's Blueprint for Changemakers, we include many menus of options for building a movement for health equity, access to healthcare, place-based approaches, and early childhood development and education, as well as employment and income security. I know you can't read the slide, but I hope you can see that the guide notes those policies that most address each of the fundamental drivers of health inequity, the rainbow header in the chart here: structural discrimination, wealth, opportunity, power, and governance. And you'll recognize some of these threads in the specific policies woven from the prior slides into this chart, which is just focused on place-based approaches. Our policy scan for advancing rural equity and prosperity has even more suggestions. Again, this is just a screenshot so that you'll recognize the tool in the wild. Here, I've pulled out those policies from the scan that had the strongest partner support in our conversation with our Thrive Rural partners. Here they are. You can see, again, agricultural workers' rights, broadband expansion, access to healthcare coverage, housing interventions and housing trust funds, native arts programs, paid family and paid sick leave, and local hiring. And to this list, I would add some upstream approaches more central to what we know are in many tobacco prevention and cancer prevention work plans, like retail environment interventions and water quality improvements and access. So our goal here is to learn from you. I think that the poll situation is maybe already burned. Abby, let me know if that's incorrect. But our goal, at least, is to get you all thinking and engaged in conversation with your partners or to-be partners about which of these policy solutions feel most connected to priorities in your community. You may recognize some of your core policy areas here, and we would love to hear about them. Maybe chat us, since the poll doesn't seem to be, I think we have already done the poll, but go ahead and drop chats if you are working on these upstream solutions directly. We would love to know that. And for others who maybe don't have core policy areas like this in their work plans, our goal is that these related strategies might help you identify key partners to your work, or maybe new partners, maybe even some specific provisions that can be pulled into your policy work, or just related community priorities that you have to discuss just to reflect the lived experiences of your community and resident partners. So thank you so much for using the chat. I love seeing this flow through. Obviously, some retail environment stuff, healthcare access, not necessarily coverage alone, but access, housing and workforce development and economic stability. Again, lots of retail environment from the tobacco prevention coming through, environmental preservation, local hiring. This is really exciting. I'm sorry you can't see the poll results, but it's really exciting for us to see over here. And we will be sharing these slides. And with that, we will share some highlights from the chat, as well as the resources and the hyperlinks that we shared. So you'll have the deck, you'll have the recording, as well as some of what we're learning in the polls and the chat. So thank you so much for participating. And the question arises, how do we evaluate which of these policy options are useful in our communities? There are so many policy menus. I see some love for policy menus in the chat too. That's awesome to hear. That brings us back to that policy scan that I presented on a few slides back. The Rural Equity and Prosperity Policy Scan includes these measures. For every single policy it includes. Is there a rural benefit? Will it support racial equity? Does it support equitable economic development? What's the magnitude of impact for the intervention so far, given what we've seen in the data? What's the strength of the evidence? And then what are elements of community engagement, optimizing community assets, and evaluation and monitoring when included in the policy? And finally, preemption, whether it's legally feasible. We crosswalk all of these in the policy menus. Jessica, can you show us what that looks like and where we're going?
Yeah, I'm happy to, Sarah. So let's zoom in on this section of the policy scan. Again, like Sarah said, these resources are available and you'll have access to the slide deck because I know it's kind of hard to read. But let's zoom in on this section of the policy scan for another preview into our focus for next week's webinar. For these two policies, conservation and agricultural workers' rights, the first four categories are evaluated as intrinsic to the policy issues. So that's when we're thinking about things, will they benefit rural places or advance racial and economic equality? And what is the magnitude of their impact? But we also don't want to forget that these three evaluation measures are contingent on how the work gets done. This is central to ChangeLab's approach to policy. Some elements of a policy are only as valuable as their implementation, or they may risk unintentional harm only as much as you do them in a certain way. So as a lawyer, I'm required to say at least once a day that it depends, and process matters, and it definitely process matters in the substantive outcomes of a policy. So this is the CDC's policy process wheel, which you likely are already familiar with. It emphasizes the ever-present and central need to partner to share power and knowledge with the community, as well as the need to evaluate that process and the final outcomes all along the way. Then you've got the standard steps. So 1 is problem identification, 2 is policy analysis, 3 is strategy and policy development, 4 is policy enactment, and 5 is policy implementation. Each step is an opportunity to center community and thereby improve health equity, not to mention to improve policy buy-in and sustainability. At ChangeLab, we really believe in this process as a tool for health equity, that we infuse an equity-driven approach across our tobacco prevention resources, just as one issue area example, along every step of the policymaking process. We encourage you to check out these resources if you work on tobacco prevention, or even if you don't. Some have repercussions regardless of policy area, and we'll be diving into those in the next week's webinar. And now I'm going to pass it back to Sarah to bring us home.
Thank you so much, Jessica and Shannon. We've got a good amount of time for Q&A, and we've had some questions already start flowing through the chat and the Q&A, it looks like. As we do that, we know some of you need to sign off. We're finished presenting a bit early, and you're welcome to do that. Please do, as you go, fill out the survey. It's so helpful to us as we seek to improve our work and our partnerships. And we would love to see you next week. Note that there's a small time change about when we'll see you, but it's not same time, same day, it's same day, an hour later, I think. So that's our second webinar. It'll be a bit shorter, and it will dive into the policy development process as a tool for equity and some specific examples of the policies that we highlighted today. Before we begin, I have two. Oh, good. The chat has, the survey link has been posted in the chat. Thank you so much, Abby, for taking care of that. I want to open the Q&A by addressing something that came up in the chat that's really, really important and includes some resources to help participants today. So the first is, having not asked the person if I can share their comment, I'll do it anonymously, but the need to distinguish tribal nations' governments as uniquely sovereign political entities. When we talk about community partnerships and community engagement, a lot of times people are thinking about residents and coalitions, and not always do we think top of mind, but it's really important that we do think about interacting with another sovereign body, another government. So that's really important. The commenter also emphasizes that racializing Indigenous populations contributes to our erasure, to their erasure and ongoing health disparities. So it's really important to name that. I think part of it is acknowledging, as we did once or twice, the insufficiencies of the term BIPOC and the harm that it can cause. Yet also it reflects a body of research with significant showings. And that is a tension that we have tried to interact with. And it does seem like for some people that's been really useful, and for others it's hard and has rubbed them the wrong way and is contributing to systemic harms that it's important that we name. So thanks for that. Also, the importance of acknowledging tobacco is an Indigenous ancestral crop that has been culturally appropriated for commercial profit and exploitation. That is really powerfully said, an important reiteration, and aligns really well with that timeline we shared at the beginning. We could just keep adding lists of human experience that have been subjected to that timeline in the United States, and that's like hard and depressing, but also powerful, and we can't forget it, and we can't let them be dissolved into each other as much as we see that alignment. And the last thing is a recommendation for the Johns Hopkins Center for Indigenous Health Research and their collaborations with tribal nations to define and operationalize Indigenous determinants of health. We also have a number of partners at the Public Health Law Center who are working with the Public Health Accreditation Board in the tribal context, where a lot of the policy work on upstream drivers and root causes can be infused into the foundational public health services that we all work in. So thank you so much for providing such critical critique and emphasis of elements that are absolutely central to our work. Thank you. So thank you. And I'm hearing a lot of +1s. So I take no credit for that. That is absolutely coming from the chat. I think we have a really sophisticated crowd of participants who are willing to say the hard things. We really value that. It's not surprising, but it's nice to see. Thank you. I echo that. Thanks. And there's a lot of that coming through. I know you can't see that, the original poster. This is recorded. It will be available. Panelists, are you seeing anything that we can address directly in the Q&A? Oh, I know this one. Okay. We have 2 questions, and I'm interested because one talks about mapping. In this case, Paula's population mapping, geographic mapping, but Shannon, I'm also thinking about legal outcomes mapping and legal epi. But I think this is an effort to help prevent that erasure that we've been talking about a few times today, that the mapping helps lift up that visibility and not let it disappear. And this commenter is asking about how maps can sometimes seem to downplay the population presence, which is actually a result of genocide and cultural genocide. And I think that is certainly the case with populations. And as we highlight legal impacts over time, that might be a way to raise up those inequities that are being perpetuated by laws and policies. Shannon, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I'll just say that there are a lot of organizations working and advocating for this, so we can share advocating specifically for Indigenous data sovereignty. So the right of an Indigenous nation to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their data. So there are organizations working for this, and they have much better resources than we can provide. So we could share links to that. But yeah, a lot of it stems from that need specifically, but I can't give you like specific examples of how data should be collected, but these organizations definitely have created a lot of resources around that.
Yeah, the Network for Public Health Law also has a recent report that came out about data sovereignty in tribal nations. Another really good one to check out. We can absolutely include these links in the email when we share out the resources, anything that came up, including the recommendations from people in the chat. So if you have other recommendations to add to that list, we're more than happy to send just like a list of links in different categories for the issues that we talked about. We're happy to play that way station in terms of sharing. Another question that came up is about immigration. And the ask was for like almost for direct services support for what's happening right now in this country with migrant and refugee and asylum seeking folks. And to that end, I'll say we can include some resources. It's outside the scope of what ChangeLab works on. We don't provide direct services, but we're certainly aware of the upstream policy implications that are related to that. We work more at the local and state level and believe that that's really important and can be powerful tools when it comes to public health. There's obviously a lot of work happening right now at the national level on that, which again is experts outside of our organization that we're happy to make connections to offline. That was another question that came up. One last question, I think that's coming up in the chat that I know I can address directly. Someone hoping to talk with experts, researchers. What I think, I feel like as a lawyer, we always avoid using the word expert, like who's an expert, but also, you know, people who are doing this research and thinking about these things every day, but overcoming obstacles in the path of healing and empowerment and autonomy for individuals. That's a really interesting one. Also outside the scope of what ChangeLab Solutions does, but a number of our partners work on that. And the one that most comes to mind in like the professional space is Human Impact Partners, or HIP. They've got a lot of work about both nonprofit organizations and government entities, for those of you who are in a government setting, to think about healing and empowerment as in and how it needs to be embedded in the way we work together internally at your organizations, for example, when it comes to institutional change, and also more broadly our work in the world. So I would recommend Human Impact Partners, and can certainly save the chat, plug in some of those resources. Just checking the chat. You know, we're still waiting to include the registration link. Oh, there it is. Abby added the registration link for next week, where we will dive deeper into the policy process as a tool for equity and some specific examples of the policies we talked about today and how they've played out in some specific rural counties. With that, I think we're going to go ahead and end a bit early. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much to Gia, to Abby and Kellen and your whole team of folks who helped put this together. It's been an honor too to see the chat and to hear your questions. Thank you very much for your engagement. Reach out, follow up. Everything in the deck is going to be hyperlinked. And thank you too for the resource recommendations. We'll include those as well in the email that will go out with the recording.